morning. We're starting Descartes today. There might have been some confusion. There was with me, because when I looked at the week's notes for this week, I saw I was still on Aquinas. No, that's wrong. So I put both this week's and next week's, because next week's is actually this week's. Does that make sense? For some reason, I ended up with an extra week in there somehow. I think because I used to spend more time on the Middle Ages before I went on to Aquinas, but I don't do that anymore. So we can have more space for contemporaries when we get to the end of the course. However, Descartes is the main topic today. And Hobbes, I'll try to do both Hobbes and Descartes, more emphasis on Descartes today, and on Wednesday more emphasis on Hobbes, but the two of them are contemporaries, at least wrote to one another, may have met, probably not. At least Hobbes met Galileo, though, so there is definitely connections, and that's a big difference from what we've been looking at so far in the course, where there's a lot of years between different philosophers. In the modern period, we're looking at a lot of people that are actually contemporaries and even familiar with one another. One of the latest ones was Leibniz from this period, and Leibniz actually tried to visit Thomas Hobbes. He didn't actually see him because Hobbes was too old to really respond to his email, so he didn't connect with Leibniz, but Leibniz was trying to stop by and visit him as a younger man visiting an older philosopher that he was very familiar with in his writings and so on. So there's through this whole group, which would include Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Spinoza, who will be doing, John Locke, who will be doing, Bishop Berkeley, and Gottfried Leibniz. So when we put all those together, we're really looking at a group that's close enough that they could even visit one another. Leibniz spent 2 weeks with Spinoza. After he had hoped to visit Thomas Hobbes, he ended up spending 2 weeks with Spinoza. Who knows what they talked about, but everybody figures Spinoza was a real influence on Leibniz. Okay, so and we should also throw in, besides Galileo, we should also throw in Sir Isaac Newton, who's in that bunch, that time period, a little later, but nonetheless he's in there. So what happens that makes this all of a sudden the modern period? Science, basically, and the invention of science in closer to what we think of as science today. And the person that did that is Descartes. And the book that he did that in was his Discourse on the Method. It's a much longer title. If you look at the Discourse on the Method, etc. But Discourse on the Method is what we all call it today. And besides that book, which is his most famous, the other one is his Meditations, and that's the one that college students are usually the one, that's the book that they usually have to read, and that's the one where he goes through his doubt, where he apparently is raised in an environment where people who teach in the various schools, and there are various ones now, there's Protestant schools as well as Catholic schools. He's raised and schooled by Jesuits, so he's of the Catholic side of things, and apparently always remained Catholic. So that's kind of interesting. But there are Protestant schools around, and there's also differences even among the Catholics among themselves. And I put William of Ockham up as a beginnings to look at this, because as you'd think, with Aquinas being basically accepted as dogma, that settled the problems. And of course it did settle a lot of the problems as he merged Aristotelian thinking into the dogma of the church. But remember, that didn't please everybody. It confused a lot of people. And in fact, even after the church pretty much accepted Aquinas' solution to the conflicts, there were people that took sides. And the sides were primarily the old side of Plato versus Aristotle. And one of the examples of that period is William of Ockham, who's, by the way, also often referred to as the first Protestant, which is odd, because he didn't start his own Protestant sect. But he was earlier, say, than Martin Luther, and his conflict with the church over dogma was somewhat of a liberal bent, and so in a sense he was, in fact they tortured him for some of his views. He was jailed for a while, not a happy situation, but they did release him and he continued to live as a monk. But he's most famous for what's referred to as Occam's razor. How many folks have heard of Occam's razor? Yes, it's pretty famous. And basically, it means that when you're faced with two explanations for something, basically the simplest explanation is probably correct. That's pretty much, the basics of it. Let me show you the page since they're offering it here. When you have different explanations, pick the one that's parsimonious. It's also called the principle of parsimony, which no one calls it. Just call it Occam's razor. But so, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. And of course, what is this? This is a criticism of Aquinas. Because Aquinas, remember, doubled the ontology. How did he solve the problem? He doubled the ontology, which we still use, by the way. We still use all the vocabulary. We didn't give up any of Plato's vocabulary. We didn't give up any of Aristotle's vocabulary. We doubled it. So in a sense, we've got multiple entities out there. And Occam was a nominalist. He thought only specific named, so nom means name, right? Only specific named things, like this desk, exist. You don't have deskness existing as a universal idea that is invisible, but nonetheless is a thing somehow. Don't have that as far as William of Ockham is concerned. By the way, if you saw the snow sculptures, anybody visit the snow sculptures down in near Ship Creek for a rendezvous? One of the sculptures has written around the bottom in snow, which was interesting, that the most essential thing is the things that are not visible to the eye. And I thought, Plato! As I saw that. So that's not William of Ockham. That would be his competitor, and his competitor is Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus literally means Duns the Scot, although I understand that he was actually from Ireland, but apparently at the time they thought of the Irish as Scots as well. I'm not sure if that's, I'm going by memory on that. It's weird. But Duns was his name, and he was considered brilliant, ended up teaching in France and Paris, and took just the opposite point of view of William of Ockham. He was a follower of Plato and the idealism, and believed that universals existed and were actually the main things, as opposed to the physical things which have a resemblance to the ideas. They participate in the ideas, but they're not the real thing. Now, the most famous thing about Duns Scotus was that his followers wore a pointed cap, which was his kind of uniform. I guess this is similar to what they're talking about. And over time, that became a punishment in schools, where teachers that didn't like a kid for being an idiot or whatever the heck the kid was doing, they would sit the kid in the corner of the room and put a pointed cap on the kid, and they called that a dunce cap. So that's just the opposite, really, of the association with the duncemen. The duncemen were considered brilliant, So putting a dunce cap on a student for being weird or whatever, that's weird thing for them to be famous for. But the reason I'm bringing them up is these two points of view were very lively and debated at the time of Descartes, and as a result, when he was growing up and listening to his teachers, they were arguing with one another, and it became very clear to him that knowledge wasn't really settled. And that was frustrating, of course. It is today. But we have a big problem, if you think about it, the way, especially with our news media and things, how we're totally confused, it seems, in the media at least, over whether we should believe something or not. We have the whole business of facts as opposed to fake facts, fake news, etc. You've heard that, I'm sure, and you're wondering, well, how do we know? And a lot of folks feel like, well, there's actually no way to tell because there's so many possibilities, etc. There's perspective. I'm guilty of this myself. How do you resolve the whole business of this model-dependent realism, if you want to call it that, and say, well, Einstein is right. There's definitely rules within a particular context that you have to accept as factual. But outside of that context, there's other contexts. The Earth is going around the sun? Yes. The sun is going around the Earth? Yes. Which context do you want to believe? Well, they're both useful. So in this particular context, we go this way. But in this context, we go this way. That sounds an awful lot like you're confused and you don't really believe either one is true in some real sense. Well, the point, of course, is that, as human beings that conceptualize things using our language and these different maps, so to speak, of cognition, we have these models. And as we use the models for different things, we want to play in this game in order to accomplish this task, but we want to play in this game in order to accomplish this task. Both are useful. In fact, we might have more models yet to be invented that we haven't even had young people and scientists figure out. Just with the way quantum mechanics is floundering right now, there's so many different possibilities. One of these models eventually someday might come out as like the dominant model that people will use in order to predict particular events and maybe even make tools that will mimic the quantum minds of human beings, perhaps, thinking that that's the case, right? Well, that feels like we don't know what's true. Well, in a sense it is, because if what you're thinking is that there's one real truth and all the others are kind of fictional, that's not the way that whole model of models works. Instead, we're saying that truth is dependent on the context, the model that we're using. And that's where truth comes from. Thank you, Aristotle. Thank you, Descartes. Thank you, contemporaries that feel that way. So that could be confusing. How do you explain it? Well, we have to say that things are much more complex than we would like. That's our main answer to that. Things are more complex. We have to see which perspectives are being involved, figure out what kind of results you're looking for. Do we want the people in Gaza to have their own state? Do we want them to have a successful way of living? yeah, I mean, you could see the different points of view that people take. Some guy just set himself on fire out in front of the almost killed himself, as far as I know. Maybe has killed himself. Has he?
Yeah.
He died? I hadn't heard that. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, so Descartes, frustrated by the state of affairs as he's growing up. By the way, let me quick throw in a few other individuals going, that are doing things. Of course, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. I don't know if you had to memorize that poem as a kid.